Welcome back to the course ASP.NET Core MVC Deep Dive. I'm Philip Ekberg. Model binding is one of the most important aspects of ASP.NET Core MVC. It's how we get data into our actions and mapped appropriately to our models. Model binding can be achieved in a few different ways. When ASP.NET Core performs its URL match, a look at the data that's coming in from the HTTP request, it will also use that data to figure out which action to execute and which endpoint this HTTP request will belong to. During this process, the data will be mapped into your appropriate model or the data that the action is requesting. The data can be coming from different places, such as the query parameters, a form post, headers, and so forth. When this model binding takes place, it's really important to understand that if you expect some data to be passed into it, sometimes it's optional and sometimes it's not. What happens, though, if the end user passes more data than you expect, or sets a field on your model that you really don't want to expose? This could eventually lead to some security concerns. The route that points to your action could in fact include components that will translate into the input parameters. We saw this with the product ID and the slug. As long as the segment inside the route corresponds with the name in your action, ASP.NET Core will attempt to map that data from the URL into an appropriate parameter on the action. If it's not a part of the URL that we are defining in our route, then we can set it using a query parameter. We could also define that it's coming from the request body. There are multiple built-in sources that we could use, for example, from query, from route, from form, from body, or from header. These could allow us to grab the data from different places. If you've defined a simple class that you want to use as your model, it needs to have a parameterless constructor. Otherwise, it won't be able to instantiate that and bind the appropriate properties. You can use records for this as well, which will use a prior constructor, and that will work. As a word of caution, if you were to use, for example, the product as the model and not introduce a separate product model, you would expose all the different properties available on this class. It would be wise to instead introduce a product model. If you really want to use the product from the domain project, you can define exactly which of the properties you allow to be bound in a particular action. This can be done by using the bind attribute to define which of the different properties that you want to bind from the incoming data. This is used in form posts, for example. If you were to expose things that you don't want to bind, you could eventually allow the user to set data that they're not allowed to. There's an interface called iParsable that you could implement to define how something is parsed. In such a scenario, you would expect the input data to be passed into this parser as a string, and it's your job to split it up into its appropriate sections. It would rely on a query parameter containing that data, and then you have to parse that yourself and tell the model binder if it was able to parse that or not. There are also bind attributes that allow you to define if a property is required or if you should never bind that particular property. Most often, you'll find yourself to perform the model binding against models that you've defined in the MVC project. That somewhat replicates the exposed functionality from your domain layer, but it's catered to a specific action or view. It may be catered towards a form that expects some data to be posted into a particular action. This will allow you to define rules for how that model is bound. It could define a range of appropriate values, how a particular field has to look in terms of applying a regex to that. Model binding can be very complex, but at the same time, it's very useful to ensure that the data that's coming into the action is what we expect it to be. And you can be very specific and define exactly what you allow and what you don't allow.